Long before written history, people across the world were already shaping stone, earth, and landscape with intention, not randomly, not simply to survive. From hidden settlements and quiet burial mounds to vast planned communities, these places reveal planning, cooperation, and knowledge that doesn't fit simple timelines. They weren't built to impress an audience. They were built to last, to function, and to hold meaning for the people who return to them generation after generation. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is located in southeastern Turkey, on a limestone plateau overlooking the Harran Plain. The landscape is dry, open, and windswept, with wide visibility in every direction. There are no rivers immediately nearby, no forests, and no natural shelter that would normally attract permanent settlement. Yet, on this exposed hilltop stands one of the most consequential archaeological sites ever discovered. The site is identified archaeologically as Göbekli Tepe. Radiocarbon dating places its earliest construction at around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. This predates agriculture, pottery, metal tools, and permanent villages as traditionally understood in human history. Göbekli Tepe was built by communities still living as hunter-gatherers. There's no evidence of domesticated animals or cultivated crops at the time of its earliest phases. This fact alone forces a reconsideration of long-held assumptions about how and why monumental architecture emerged. The site consists of multiple circular and oval enclosures, each defined by massive T-shaped limestone pillars set into stone walls. At the center of each enclosure stand two larger pillars, positioned opposite one another. These central pillars dominate the space, both physically and symbolically. The pillars are carved from local limestone and can weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected using stone tools alone. The level of planning required to achieve this suggests organized labor and shared purpose rather than spontaneous construction. The T-shape of the pillars is consistent across the site. Many researchers interpret this form as stylized human figures. This interpretation is supported by carvings of arms, hands, belts, and loincloths visible on some pillars. These are not abstract shapes. They represent bodies. Carved reliefs of animals cover many pillar surfaces. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, and other creatures appear in high relief, rendered with precision and variation. These carvings are not decorative filler. They are placed deliberately, often facing inward toward the center of the enclosure. No two pillars are identical. While the overall form is standardized, the carvings differ, suggesting individual or group-specific symbolism rather than mass production. The enclosures are partially sunken into the bedrock. Builders cut into the limestone plateau, then constructed walls and set pillars within the excavated space. This process required advanced planning and coordination, not incremental building. There's no evidence that these enclosures were roofed. The spaces were open to the sky. This openness suggests that visibility, light, and perhaps celestial movement were important to how the site functioned. Despite the scale of construction, Göbekli Tepe shows no signs of domestic life. No hearths, no cooking installations, no refuse pits associated with daily living. The absence of houses is striking. Instead, the site appears to have been used intermittently. Groups likely gathered here for specific events rather than living permanently on the hilltop. This pattern suggests that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a central meeting place rather than a settlement. The organization of space reinforces this idea. Movement within the enclosures is controlled. Entry points are narrow. The central pillars dominate attention, drawing focus inward rather than outward. Animal bones found at the site indicate large-scale feasting. The remains come from wild species hunted elsewhere and brought to the site. This implies coordinated activity involving many people, possibly from different groups. Such gatherings would have required planning, cooperation, and shared belief systems. Göbekli Tepe appears to be a place where social bonds were reinforced through ritual rather than through daily survival activities. One of the most puzzling aspects of the site is its intentional burial. After a period of use, each enclosure was deliberately filled in with rubble, stone, and debris. The pillars were not toppled or destroyed. They were carefully covered. This act was not abandonment through neglect. It was intentional closure. After burial, new enclosures were built nearby, repeating the same basic pattern. This cycle of construction and burial continued for centuries. The site grew through addition rather than replacement. creating a layered landscape of ritual architecture. The decision to bury monumental structures raises questions about how these communities understood space, memory, and continuity. Ending use did not mean erasing meaning. Göbekli Tepe challenges the assumption that religion followed agriculture. Here, shared ritual activity appears to have preceded permanent settlement rather than emerging from it. Some researchers argue that sites like Göbekli Tepe may have encouraged the development of agriculture by bringing groups together, regularly increasing pressure to manage food resources. Whether or not this is the case, the site demonstrates that complex social organization existed long before farming societies. The builders of Göbekli Tepe invested enormous effort in stone at a time when survival itself was uncertain. Karahan Tepe. Karahan Tepe lies in southeastern Turkey, east of Göbekli Tepe, within the same limestone plateau that stretches across the Şanlıurfa region. The landscape here is open and exposed, shaped by wind, erosion, and long seasonal cycles. Like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe is positioned away from major water sources and agricultural zones, a choice that immediately raises questions about purpose. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Karahan Tepe, also known as Keçeli Tepe. Radiocarbon dating places its primary use in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, roughly between 9500 and 9000 BCE. This places Karahan Tepe within the same cultural horizon as Göbekli Tepe, but not as a copy of it. Excavation at Karahan Tepe has revealed a different architectural language. While Göbekli Tepe is defined by large circular enclosures, Karahan Tepe features a combination of rock-cut spaces, freestanding pillars, and carved bedrock installations. Much of the architecture is integrated directly into the limestone substrate rather than built entirely above ground. One of the most striking features of the site is the presence of upright stone pillars emerging from bedrock floors. These pillars are shorter than those at Göbekli Tepe, but they are no less intentional. Their placement suggests they were meant to be encountered within enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces rather than from a distance. Several pillars at Karahan Tepe show carved human features. Heads, faces, and bodily elements are rendered directly into stone, sometimes emerging from walls or floors. These are not reliefs applied to finished structures. They are part of the architecture itself. In one chamber, a large stone head appears to rise from the bedrock, its facial features carefully shaped. This carving does not stand alone. It is integrated into a space that controls movement and visibility, suggesting that approach and encounter were important aspects of how the site functioned. Animal imagery is also present, though less abundant than at Göbekli Tepe. Where animals do appear, they are carved with clarity and intent. Their placement suggests symbolic emphasis rather than decoration. The site includes deep circular pits cut into the limestone. These pits are not storage features. Their size, depth, and finish indicate deliberate construction for purposes not directly tied to subsistence. Unlike later Neolithic settlements, Karahan Tepe shows no evidence of domestic structures. There are no hearths, no grinding stones associated with daily food preparation, and no permanent housing layouts. This absence reinforces the interpretation of Karahan Tepe as a place used for gathering, ritual activity, or symbolic practice rather than habitation. The builders of Karahan Tepe worked directly with bedrock. Instead of transporting all materials, they reshaped the landscape itself. Floors were carved flat, walls were cut back, and architectural elements were left standing as part of the original stone. This approach suggests a different relationship with material than later architecture. Stone was not merely a building material. It was the site. Labor organization at Karahan Tepe would have required coordination. Cutting limestone with the stone tools is slow and physically demanding. The scale of excavation implies repeated effort over time, not a single event. The site's layout indicates controlled access. Entrances are narrow, movement is guided, and spaces are segmented. These features limit how many people could occupy certain areas simultaneously. Such control suggests that participation may have been selective. Some individuals may have entered inner spaces, while others remained outside or at thresholds. Like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe shows evidence of intentional closure. Some spaces were filled in deliberately after use. This was not abandonment caused by collapse or erosion, but a conscious act. This practice of burial preserves architecture while ending its function. It also suggests a worldview in which closure was as meaningful as construction. Karahan Tepe does not replicate Göbekli Tepe's monumentality. Instead, it explores intimacy. Spaces are tighter, encounters are closer, and imagery is more directly human. This difference implies diversity within the same cultural sphere. The people who built these sites were not following a single blueprint. They experimented with form, space, and symbolism. The proximity of Karahantepe to other pre-pottery Neolithic sites suggests a network rather than an isolated center. Knowledge, labor, and ideas likely moved between locations. Rather than representing a single origin point, Karahantepe contributes to a regional pattern of early monumental behavior. Its emphasis on carved bedrock and human imagery suggests a focus on embodiment and presence rather than abstraction. The site shows that early Neolithic communities were capable of complex spatial planning without agriculture, metallurgy, or centralized states. Karahantepe challenges the idea that early monuments needed scale to be powerful. Here, meaning is embedded in proximity, texture, and encounter. The architecture does not dominate the horizon. It draws people inward, down into stone-cut spaces where light, shadow, and form shape experience. What remains at Karahantepe is incomplete. Excavation continues, and much of the site is still buried. Each new exposure adds complexity rather than clarity. Karahantepe expands the picture introduced by Göbekli Tepe. It shows that early ritual architecture took multiple forms, even within the same landscape. Together, these sites suggest that monumentality emerged not as a single invention, but as a series of experiments in how humans gathered, marked space, and expressed shared meaning through stone. Aşıklı Höyük. Aşıklı Höyük is located in central Anatolia, near the Menendez River, in what is now the Aksaray province of Turkey. Unlike the exposed hilltops of Göbekli Tepe or Karahantepe, this site sits in a fertile river valley. The surrounding landscape provided water, arable soil, and access to obsidian sources in nearby volcanic regions. These conditions supported long-term occupation rather than seasonal gathering. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Aşıklı Höyük. Radiocarbon dates place its main occupation between approximately 8200 and 7400 BCE. This period marks a crucial transition in human history, when communities began to experiment with sedentary life, animal management, and new social structures. Aşıklı Höyük represents one of the earliest permanently occupied villages known. The site consists of tightly packed mud brick houses built directly against one another. There are no streets in the modern sense. Movement occurred across rooftops and through shared courtyards, creating a dense and inward-focused settlement. The houses are rectangular, with thick mud brick walls and flat roofs supported by wooden beams. Interiors are simple, floors were plastered, and walls were occasionally renewed with fresh layers of clay. Hearths and work areas indicate daily domestic activity rather than ritual specialization. What distinguishes Aşıklı Höyük is continuity. Houses were rebuilt repeatedly in the same locations. When a structure deteriorated, it was leveled and rebuilt on top of earlier remains. Over centuries, this process created the mound visible today. This rebuilding pattern suggests strong attachment to place. Families or groups return to the same plots generation after generation, reinforcing social memory through architecture. Animal remains recovered from the site show early stages of herd management, particularly with sheep and goats. These animals were not yet fully domesticated, but hunting patterns shifted toward controlled exploitation rather than opportunistic capture. Plant remains indicate increasing reliance on cultivated cereals, though wild resources continued to play a role. The economy at Aşıklı Höyük reflects experimentation rather than completion. Obsidian tools are abundant. The proximity of volcanic sources allowed residents to produce sharp blades and points efficiently. Tool production appears standardized, indicating shared knowledge and repeated practice. One of the most distinctive aspects of Aşıklı Höyük is its treatment of the dead. Burials were placed beneath house floors, often within domestic spaces. This practice integrated ancestors directly into living environments. Some burials show evidence of skull removal after decomposition. Skulls may have been curated or displayed elsewhere before eventual reburial. This behavior suggests complex beliefs surrounding identity and memory. Unlike Göbekli Tepe or Karahantepe, Aşıklı Höyük does not display monumental architecture. There are no large enclosures, no carved pillars, and no overt ceremonial buildings. Meaning here is embedded in repetition and proximity rather than scale. The absence of public monuments does not indicate simplicity. Instead, social organization was expressed through shared domestic patterns and long-term cooperation. Fire use is evident throughout the site. Hearths were central to domestic life, but their placement varies, indicating flexible use rather than standardized layouts. Evidence of health and injury has been recovered from human remains. Skeletal analysis suggests physically demanding labor and occasional trauma. Life here required constant effort. Despite these challenges, the settlement persisted for centuries. This endurance reflects successful adaptation rather than fragile experimentation. There is limited evidence of social hierarchy. Houses are similar in size and construction. Grave goods are minimal and evenly distributed. This suggests relatively egalitarian social organization. Over time, changes in architecture and subsistence indicate gradual transformation rather than abrupt transition. Aşıklıhoyuk captures a moment when new ways of living were tested incrementally. The site was eventually abandoned. The reasons remain unclear, but environmental stress, resource pressure, or social change may have played roles. What remains is a layered record of early village life, preserved through repeated rebuilding rather than monumental display. Aşıklıhoyuk demonstrates that the shift toward settled life did not begin with grand architecture. It began with houses, hearths, and shared space. Here, stone and mud brick were used not to impress, but to endure daily use across generations. The site shows how early communities negotiated permanence, ancestry, and cooperation without centralized authority or formal institutions. Aşıklıhoyuk anchors the transition between mobile, foraging, and settled living, revealing how stability emerged through repetition rather than revolution. Its remains continue to inform how we understand the slow emergence of village life in the Neolithic world. Skara Brae is located on the west coast of mainland Orkney, Scotland, set directly beside the Atlantic Ocean. The site sits low against the shoreline, exposed to wind, salt spray, and shifting sand. Its survival is not the result of deliberate preservation, but of burial. For centuries, Skara Brae was sealed beneath sand dunes, protected from weather and later human disturbance. Archaeologically, the settlement is identified as Skara Brae. It dates to roughly 3200–2500 BCE, placing it firmly within the Neolithic period. During this time, farming communities across northern Europe were establishing permanent villages, yet few sites preserve domestic life as clearly as this one. Skara Brae consists of a cluster of stone-built houses connected by narrow covered passageways. The houses are arranged around a central open area, forming a compact village rather than a scattered settlement. Each structure follows a similar plan, indicating shared building knowledge and social norms. The houses are partially dug into the ground, using earth and midden material for insulation. Walls were built from flat stone slabs stacked without mortar. This method provided strength and thermal stability in a harsh coastal climate. Inside each house is a single main room with built-in stone furniture. Beds, shelves, storage boxes, and hearths were carved or assembled directly from stone. These elements are not decorative. They define how space was used and organized. The hearth occupies a central position in every house. It provided heat, light, and a focal point for daily activity. Smoke would have escaped through roof openings, though the exact roof construction remains uncertain. Stone beds are positioned on either side of the room, usually with the larger bed on the right when entering. This repeated pattern suggests a shared cultural rule, governing interior arrangement rather than individual preference. Opposite the entrance stands a stone dresser, a large, upright structure with shelves. Its placement ensures it is immediately visible upon entry. This suggests it held items of social or symbolic importance, not just practical tools. The use of stone furniture is distinctive. Timber was scarce in Orkney, and stone offered durability. More importantly, stone fixed the layout permanently. Rooms were not rearranged easily. Daily life followed stable patterns. The passageways connecting the houses are narrow and roofed. They limit movement to single-file passage and protect against wind. Their design suggests that circulation through the village was controlled and intentional. Skara Brae shows no evidence of defensive walls or fortifications. The village relied on location and community rather than barriers. This absence suggests that conflict was not a primary concern during its occupation. Artifacts recovered from the site include pottery, stone tools, bone implements, and carved objects. These indicate domestic activities such as food, preparation, tool production, and personal adornment. Animal bones and plant remains show a mixed economy. Residents kept cattle and sheep, fished, collected shellfish, and cultivated crops. This diversity reduced dependence on any single resource. Water management is visible in drainage channels built beneath floors. These channels directed waste and runoff away from living spaces, improving hygiene and comfort. Burial practices are not well represented within the settlement itself. Human remains are scarce, suggesting that burial occurred elsewhere, separating domestic and funerary spaces. The uniformity of house size and layout suggests limited social hierarchy. There are no large houses that stand apart from others. Material differences between dwellings are minimal. The village was occupied for several centuries. Over time, houses were repaired, modified, and maintained. Despite environmental challenges, the community persisted. Eventually, Skara was abandoned. The cause is uncertain, but climate change, increasing storm intensity, or resource pressure may have contributed. After abandonment, windblown sand gradually covered the site. This burial preserved walls and interiors at a level rarely seen in prehistoric settlements. Modern excavation revealed not only structures, but patterns of daily life. Skara allows archaeologists to reconstruct how people moved, worked, and rested within their homes. The village does not rely on monumentality. There are no towering stones or ceremonial enclosures. Meaning here is embedded in repetition, routine, and shared space. Skara demonstrates that Neolithic innovation was not limited to ritual or symbolic architecture. It extended into domestic design, comfort, and organization. The stone houses reflect a deep understanding of environment. Builders responded to wind, cold, and scarcity with practical solutions rather than grand gestures. Skara shows how permanence could be achieved through modest means. Stone was used not to dominate the landscape, but to create stable interiors within it. The settlement remains one of the clearest records of prehistoric domestic life in Europe, preserved not through intention, but through circumstance. Its structures continue to define how archaeologists understand daily life in Neolithic communities, offering detail where most sites provide only fragments. Douth. Douth is located in the Boyne Valley of Eastern Ireland, set on a low ridge overlooking the River Boyne. The landscape here is gently rolling rather than dramatic, shaped by fertile soils and long-term human activity. This valley contains one of the densest concentrations of Neolithic monuments in Europe, yet Douth is often less discussed than its neighbors. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Douth. Construction dates to around 3200 BCE, placing Douth in the same period as Newgrange and Noath. Together, these monuments form a coherent ceremonial landscape rather than isolated structures. Douth consists of a large circular earthen mound, originally faced with stone, enclosing an internal stone-built passage and chamber system. The mound measures over 80 meters in diameter, making it one of the largest passage tombs in Ireland. The passage at Douth is long and narrow, constructed from upright stone slabs and capped with lintels. Movement through the passage is slow and controlled. The floor rises gradually toward the interior, reinforcing a sense of progression rather than direct access. Inside, the passage leads to a cruciform chamber with side recesses. The chamber is corbelled, with stones projecting inward as they rise, creating a stable roof without mortar. This technique required careful balance and precise placement. Douth contains extensive stone art. Curbstones around the base of the mound are decorated with carved motifs, including spirals, lozenges, and zigzag patterns. These carvings are not random. They repeat across the Boyne Valley, suggesting a shared symbolic language. Some carvings at Douth differ in style from those at Newgrange, indicating variation rather than uniformity. This suggests that while the builders shared beliefs, individual monuments retained distinct identities. Unlike Newgrange, Douth's passage is not aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. Instead, it is associated with the winter solstice sunset. At that time of year, light enters the chamber briefly, illuminating the interior before fading. This alignment is less visually dramatic than at Newgrange, but it is no less deliberate. It marks the same seasonal threshold from a different moment in the solar cycle. The emphasis on sunset rather than sunrise suggests complementary roles within the Boyne Valley complex. These monuments did not compete. They worked together to structure time and ritual across the landscape. Evidence of burial at Douth is limited but consistent with collective use. Cremated remains and small artifacts have been recovered, indicating episodic ritual deposition rather than continuous burial. The monument shows signs of later disturbance. In the medieval period, Douth was damaged during attempts to quarry stone. Parts of the mound were altered, and some internal stones were displaced. Despite this disturbance, the core structure remains intact. The passage and chamber still preserve the original layout and alignment. Douth's position within the Boyne Valley is intentional. It maintains visual and spatial relationships with nearby monuments, forming a network rather than a single focal point. Approach to Douth would have been ceremonial. The mound rises gradually from the surrounding land, concealing its interior until entry. This controlled visibility mirrors the experience inside the passage. The monument's scale suggests communal labor and long-term planning. Construction would have required coordinated effort over extended periods, reinforcing social cohesion. There is no evidence that Douth served a defensive or residential function. Its architecture is entirely focused on ritual movement, enclosure, and timing. The mound's mass stabilizes the internal stonework, protecting it from collapse. This integration of earth and stone reflects Neolithic engineering adapted to local conditions. Douth does not display overt hierarchy in its design. There are no elevated platforms or segregated spaces that suggest elite access. Instead, access was controlled through passage length and timing. The carvings on curbstones are placed at ground level, visible to those moving around the monument. This suggests that meaning extended beyond the interior chamber. These carvings may have marked stages of approach, reinforcing the monument's role before entry rather than only within it. Douth's long period of use indicates that its meaning persisted across generations. It was not a short-lived experiment, but a stable element of the landscape. The monument's later history reflects changing relationships with the past. Medieval reuse did not erase the structure, but altered how it was understood. Today, Douth remains quieter than its neighboring sites, yet it preserves key evidence of how Neolithic communities structured ritual time and space. Its alignment with the setting sun emphasizes closure rather than emergence, marking the end of a cycle, rather than its beginning. Douth contributes a necessary balance within the Boyne Valley, reinforcing the idea that meaning was distributed across multiple monuments rather than concentrated in one. The passage tomb remains embedded in its landscape, continuing to register light, shadow, and seasonal change much as it did when first constructed. Corral is located in the Supe Valley on the central coast of Peru, roughly 200 kilometers north of modern Lima. The valley cuts through an otherwise arid coastal desert, fed by seasonal river flow descending from the Andes. This contrast between dry surroundings and fertile corridor-shaped early settlement patterns along the Peruvian coast. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Corral. Radiocarbon dating places its main period of construction between approximately 3000 and 1800 BCE. This makes Corral one of the oldest known urban centers in the world, contemporaneous with early civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Corral is not a single monument, but a planned city. The site covers more than 60 hectares and includes multiple large platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, residential areas, and open spaces arranged around a central axis. The scale and organization indicate deliberate urban planning rather than gradual, uncoordinated growth. The most prominent features at Corral are its pyramidal platform mounds. These are step structures built from stone and earth, rising in terraces rather than smooth slopes. They are not pyramids in the later Egyptian sense, but massive platforms designed to elevate ritual and administrative activity above ground level. Construction techniques at Corral are distinctive. Builders use stone-filled mesh bags, known as shikra, made from plant fiber. These bags were stacked within retaining walls to form stable platforms. This method distributed weight evenly and reduced the risk of collapse in a seismically active region. The use of shikra bags shows advanced understanding of engineering principles. Rather than relying on massive stone blocks alone, Corral's builders combined flexible organic materials with stone to absorb movement and stress. Sunken circular plazas are another defining feature of the site. These plazas are carefully cut into the ground, with stone-lined walls and stairways descending into enclosed spaces. Their placement directly in front of major platform mounds suggests a close relationship between public gathering and elevated structures. Movement through Corral was structured. Open plazas led toward larger platforms, guiding people along prescribed paths. This organization suggests planned gatherings rather than informal use. Unlike later Andean cities, Corral shows no evidence of defensive walls or fortifications. There are no weapons, no signs of warfare, and no trauma patterns in human remains associated with conflict. This absence suggests that Corral developed in a relatively stable social environment. Corral's economy relied heavily on cooperation between coastal and inland groups. Archaeological evidence shows the use of marine resources such as fish and shellfish, alongside inland agricultural products like cotton, squash, and beans. Cotton played a key role. It was used to make fishing nets, textiles, and ropes, linking coastal fishing communities with inland farmers. This interdependence supported large populations without centralized coercion. Notably, Corral lacks many features traditionally associated with early cities. There's no evidence of writing, pottery, or monumental sculpture. Instead, organization was expressed through architecture and spatial planning. Musical instruments made from bone, including flutes, have been found at the site. Their presence suggests ceremonial activity involving sound and performance, rather than purely administrative functions. Burial evidence at Corral is limited and understated. Graves don't show strong social stratification. This suggests that leadership, if present, was not expressed through lavish funerary display. The platform mounds vary in size and layout, indicating functional differentiation rather than uniform replication. Some appear more ceremonial, others more administrative or communal. Carroll was occupied for many centuries. Construction, renovation, and expansion occurred over time, indicating long-term stability rather than rapid rise and collapse. Eventually, the site was abandoned. Environmental factors such as prolonged droughts or changes in river flow may have played a role. When occupation ended, structures were left intact rather than destroyed. Windblown sand and desert conditions help preserve architectural outlines, allowing modern researchers to reconstruct the city's layout with unusual clarity. Corral challenges the assumption that early civilization required warfare, kingship, or writing. Here, complexity emerged through planning, cooperation, and ritual coordination. The city demonstrates that monumentality can arise from collective effort rather than centralized authority enforced by force. Its architecture emphasizes openness rather than enclosure. Plazas invite gathering, while platforms elevate activity without isolating it. Corral's builders invested in permanence through method rather than mass, using engineering solutions suited to local conditions. The site represents an early experiment in urban life, one that developed independently of Old World civilizations. Corral anchors the Andean tradition of monumental architecture, Banduria. Banduria is located on the central coast of Peru, near the modern city of Huacho, where the desert meets the Pacific Ocean. The site lies only a few kilometers from the shoreline, positioned between marine ecosystems and inland valleys. This placement shaped both its economy and its architectural form. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Banduria. Radiocarbon dating places its main occupation between approximately 3000 and 2000 BCE, overlapping with the rise of Corral in the Supe Valley. Banduria belongs to the same broad cultural horizon, yet it developed its own spatial organization and local character. The site consists of multiple large platform mounds arranged around open plazas. These platforms are stepped rather than smooth, built up through layers of stone and earth. Their scale indicates long-term planning rather than short-term construction. Banduria's architecture reflects a coastal adaptation. Unlike inland sites that relied heavily on river agriculture, Banduria drew significant resources from the sea. Archaeological remains include fish bones, shells, and marine plants, indicating sustained exploitation of coastal environments. The presence of large ceremonial platforms suggests that food surplus supported communal construction. Marine resources provided protein, while inland trade likely supplied agricultural products such as cotton and gourds. The platform mounds are not identical. Some are larger and more complex, with broad stairways and terraces, while others are simpler. This variation suggests functional differentiation rather than uniform ritual replication. Open plazas at Banduria are positioned to face the platforms. These spaces would have accommodated gatherings, ceremonies, or coordinated labor activities. Their size implies participation by large groups rather than small households. Construction methods at Banduria emphasize stability over monumentality. Stones were set in courses and reinforced with earthfill. Walls are thick, but not finely finished, indicating focus on durability rather than visual refinement. As at Corral, there's no evidence of defensive architecture. No walls, bastions, or controlled gateways have been identified. The site does not appear to have been built with conflict in mind. There is also no evidence of residential neighborhoods within the monumental core. Domestic activity likely occurred nearby rather than on the platforms themselves. This separation reinforces the ceremonial nature of the central area. Bandoria shows limited evidence of social stratification. Burials are rare and lack elaborate grave goods. This suggests that leadership may have been situational or ritual rather than hereditary. One of the defining features of Bandoria is its long-term use. The site was not constructed all at once. Platforms were expanded, modified, and rebuilt over generations, creating layered architecture. This gradual growth indicates continuity, rather than sudden centralization. The community returned repeatedly to the same spaces, reinforcing shared identity through repetition. Environmental factors played a role in shaping construction. Coastal winds, shifting sands, and seismic activity required flexible building techniques. The use of earth fill allowed structures to absorb movement rather than resist it rigidly. Banduria's proximity to the ocean also influenced its orientation. Some platforms faced toward the coast, integrating horizon and sea into spatial experience. The absence of writing, sculpture, or iconography means that interpretation relies heavily on architecture. Meaning at Bandoria was expressed through scale, placement, and movement rather than symbols. Comparison with Corral highlights both similarity and diversity. While both sites share monumental platforms and plaza-centered layouts, Banduria's coastal setting shaped different economic and spatial priorities. Banduria demonstrates that early monumental construction in the Andes was not confined to a single valley or centralized authority. Multiple communities developed parallel solutions suited to local conditions. The site challenges the assumption that early complexity required inland agriculture alone. Here, marine resources supported large-scale architecture without evidence of warfare or rigid hierarchy. Banduria's decline appears gradual. There's no evidence of destruction or sudden abandonment. Environmental change or shifting trade networks may have reduced its importance over time. When use ended, the structures remained standing, gradually covered by sand and sediment. This passive preservation allowed modern excavation to recover architectural outlines. Banduria contributes to a broader understanding of early Andean civilization as a network of interacting centers rather than a single origin point. Its architecture reflects cooperation, planning, and shared ritual practice rather than coercive power. Banduria shows how monumentality can emerge quietly, through repeated effort and collective agreement rather than through conquest or centralized rule. The site remains embedded in the coastal desert, its platforms continuing to mark a moment when early societies organized labor and belief around shared space. Kirokitia. Kirokitia is located on the southern slopes of the Troodos foothills in Cyprus, overlooking the Moroni River Valley. The terrain is steep and uneven, with limited flat ground and strong seasonal variation. This landscape imposed clear constraints, shaping how early communities organized space and movement. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Kirokitia, also known as Koirakoitia. Its earliest phase dates to around 7000 BCE, placing it among the oldest Neolithic settlements in the eastern Mediterranean. This period marks the early spread of farming communities onto islands, requiring adaptation to isolation and limited resources. The early phase of Kirokitia is defined by compact, circular, stone-built houses clustered tightly together. These structures were built directly on bedrock or shallow foundations, using local limestone stacked in dry masonry. Walls are thick, providing both structural stability and thermal insulation. Each house follows a similar plan. A circular wall encloses a single interior space, sometimes divided by low partitions. Roofs were likely flat or slightly domed, supported by wooden beams and covered with organic material, though these elements have not survived. The choice of circular architecture is significant. Circles distribute weight evenly and resist collapse, especially on sloping ground. This form also limits expansion outward, encouraging rebuilding rather than enlargement. Houses were rebuilt repeatedly in the same locations. When walls deteriorated, new stone courses were added on top of earlier foundations. Over time, this process created a dense architectural fabric with little open space between structures. Movement within the settlement was restricted. Narrow passages and step paths connected clusters of houses, guiding circulation along controlled routes. There were no wide streets or open squares in the early phase. This dense layout suggests a community organized around proximity, rather than separation. Daily life unfolded in close quarters, with shared walls and limited privacy. Interior features were minimal but functional. Hearths provided heat and cooking space. Raised platforms and benches served as work surfaces or sleeping areas. Storage pits were often dug into floors. Burial practices are closely tied to domestic space. In the early phase, the dead were buried beneath house floors, sometimes directly below living areas. This practice integrated ancestors into everyday life, rather than separating them into distinct cemeteries. Grave goods are limited. Burials typically include simple objects such as stone tools or beads, but there's little evidence of social differentiation. This suggests relatively egalitarian social organization. Subsistence at Kirokitia combined early agriculture with animal management. Residents cultivated cereals and legumes and kept sheep and goats. Hunting and gathering continued to supplement diet, indicating a mixed economy. The introduction of farming to Cyprus required deliberate transport of plants and animals by sea. This implies planning, seafaring capability, and sustained contact with mainland regions. Despite these connections, Kirokitia developed its own architectural identity. The circular stone houses differ from contemporary mainland villages, reflecting adaptation to local conditions. There's no evidence of monumental or communal buildings in the early phase. Ritual, if present, was likely embedded within domestic contexts rather than expressed through separate architecture. The settlement lacks defensive walls. Protection appears to have relied on location and cohesion rather than fortification. The steep slope limited easy access, and clustered housing reduced exposure. Material culture is consistent and repetitive. Stone tools, obsidian blades, and bone implements follow standardized forms, suggesting shared knowledge and controlled production. Obsidian found at the site originated from Anatolia, indicating long-distance exchange networks. These connections persisted despite the challenges of island geography. Environmental management was essential. The hillside location reduced flood risk, but required careful control of runoff. Stone walls and terraces stabilized ground surfaces. The early phase shows little evidence of hierarchy. House sizes are similar, and access to resources appears evenly distributed. Authority, if present, was not expressed architecturally. Over centuries, the settlement expanded gradually, maintaining its basic layout while increasing density. This continuity suggests successful adaptation rather than constant restructuring. Eventually, Kirokitia's early phase gave way to later modifications, including changes in house form and spatial organization. These shifts reflect evolving social and economic needs rather than abrupt disruption. The early phase captures a moment when farming communities were still experimenting with permanence. Architecture here is practical, repetitive, and conservative. Kirokitia demonstrates that early Neolithic life on islands required careful balance between stability and flexibility. Stone was used not to display power, but to anchor households securely within a challenging environment. The settlement records how early communities negotiated crowding, ancestry, and cooperation without monumental display. Its architecture reflects endurance through repetition, rather than innovation through scale. Kirokitia's early phase remains a key reference point for understanding how Neolithic societies adapted to island landscapes while maintaining long-term continuity. Tepesialk Ziggurat. Tepesialk is located near the modern city of Kashan, on the edge of Iran's central plateau. The surrounding environment is dry and open, shaped by seasonal water flow descending from nearby mountains. This landscape offered limited but predictable resources, encouraging early communities to settle close to water channels and fertile pockets of soil. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tepesialk. It consists of two main settlement mounds, known as the North and South Hills, representing continuous occupation over several millennia. Among the most significant features is the stepped mud brick structure often referred to as the Tepesialk Ziggurat. The ziggurat at Tepesialk dates to around the late 4th millennium BCE, making it one of the earliest known examples of stepped monumental architecture in Iran. Unlike later Mesopotamian ziggurats, which are large and highly formalized, the Sialk structure represents an early stage in the development of elevated ceremonial platforms. The structure was built primarily from mud brick, shaped from local clay mixed with organic material. These bricks were sun-dried rather than fired, a common technique in regions where timber and fuel were scarce. Despite their vulnerability to erosion, mud brick structures can endure for long periods when maintained and rebuilt. The ziggurat was constructed in stepped levels, rising gradually rather than forming a smooth slope. Each level created a flat surface above the one below, suggesting controlled access and vertical progression. This layering is central to understanding its function. Unlike domestic buildings at Sialk, which cluster densely across the mounds, the ziggurat occupies a distinct position. It stands apart from residential areas, indicating separation between daily life and specialized activity. There's no evidence that the ziggurat served a defensive role. Its placement does not control access to the settlement, nor does it incorporate walls or barriers. Instead, its elevation appears symbolic and functional rather than military. The purpose of the structure is interpreted as ceremonial or administrative. Elevated platforms in early societies often served as focal points for ritual, gathering, or authority, even before formal temple architecture emerged. Excavations around the ziggurat have revealed pottery, tools, and remains associated with communal activity rather than domestic use. These finds suggest episodic gatherings rather than permanent occupation of the structure itself. The Sialk ziggurat did not emerge suddenly. It represents the accumulation of building phases. Earlier structures were leveled and built upon, gradually increasing height over generations. This process mirrors how the settlement mounds themselves formed. This method of vertical growth reflects continuity rather than rupture. Each generation added to what already existed, reinforcing memory through physical accumulation. The choice to elevate space carried meaning. Height separated certain activities from everyday movement, creating distinction without enclosure. Access to upper levels would have been limited by design. Water management was an ongoing concern at Sialk. Channels and drainage features guided runoff away from structures, protecting mud brick foundations. The survival of elevated platforms depended on careful control of moisture. The broader settlement at Tepe Sialk shows evidence of craft specialization. Pottery styles evolved over time, becoming more standardized and decorative. Metalworking appears in later phases, indicating technological transition. These developments coincided with increasing architectural complexity. The emergence of a ziggurat-like structure fits within this broader pattern of social differentiation and organized space. Unlike later urban centers, Sialk lacks monumental walls or centralized palaces. Authority, if present, was not expressed through fortification or overt dominance. Instead, architecture suggests gradual organization. The ziggurat stands as a shared focal point rather than a symbol of imposed power. The structure's form also reflects regional adaptation. While Mesopotamian ziggurats would later become standardized religious towers, Sialk's version is smaller, less formal, and integrated into a settlement rather than dominating it. This distinction highlights independent development rather than direct imitation. Ideas about elevation and ritual space may have spread, but local expression remained unique. The materials used at Sialk required constant upkeep. Mud brick erodes quickly without maintenance. The continued presence of the ziggurat implies sustained communal effort over long periods. Eventually, occupation at Tepe Sialk declined. Environmental stress, shifting trade routes, or social change may have contributed. When use ended, the structures were left to erode gradually rather than being dismantled. Over time, wind and rain reduced the ziggurat to a low mound, blending it back into the landscape. What remains today is the outline of an idea rather than a towering monument. Despite its reduced form, the significance of the Sialk ziggurat lies in timing. It represents an early moment when communities began to formalize vertical space for shared activity. The structure bridges domestic settlement and later temple architecture, showing how monumentality emerged through incremental steps rather than sudden innovation. Tepe Sialk demonstrates that complex architectural concepts developed outside Mesopotamia in parallel, rather than through simple diffusion. The ziggurat reflects experimentation with height, access, and communal focus before these ideas became fixed traditions. Its remains continue to inform how early societies organized space, authority, and ritual within evolving settlements. The site stands as a record of transition, capturing how everyday building practices gradually produced monumental form. Archaeum Circular Settlement. Archaeum is located in the southern Ural steppe of Russia, within a broad grassland landscape shaped by seasonal extremes. Summers are dry and open, winters are severe, and visibility extends across long distances. There are no natural cliffs or river bends that would normally define a defensive position. Instead, Archaeum was created as a self-contained structure placed deliberately on flat terrain. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Archaeum. It dates to roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE and is associated with the Sintashta cultural horizon, a Bronze Age society known for metallurgy, fortified settlements, and early chariot technology. Archaeum is defined by its circular plan. Two concentric walls enclose the settlement, forming a ring-shaped layout around a central open space. The outer wall measures approximately 150 meters in diameter and was constructed from timber, clay, and earth, reinforced to create a continuous defensive barrier. Between the two walls lies a ring of tightly arranged dwellings. These houses share walls and follow the curve of the settlement, creating a continuous residential band. This design leaves no unused space and minimizes exposure to the outside. The houses were rectangular internally but arranged radially, with the entrances facing inward toward the central area. Each dwelling contained hearths, storage pits, and evidence of metalworking. Daily life unfolded within a highly organized spatial system. The central area of Archaeum is open and circular. It appears to have functioned as a communal space rather than a residential zone. Its size and placement suggest gatherings, coordinated activity, or shared rituals. Access to the settlement was controlled. Entrances were narrow and limited in number, forcing movement through specific points. This design restricted entry and made monitoring easier, compensating for the lack of natural defensive features. The walls themselves were substantial, built from layers of clay, timber frames, and packed earth. They formed thick barriers resistant to fire and impact. The construction required careful planning and sustained labor. Drainage channels ran beneath the houses, directing water away from living spaces. This system indicates advanced understanding of infrastructure and long-term maintenance. Evidence of bronze casting has been found within multiple dwellings. Slag, molds, and tools suggest that metalworking was integrated into domestic life rather than isolated in specialized workshops. This integration implies that skilled production was distributed across households rather than centralized under elite control. Knowledge was shared within the community. The uniformity of house size and layout suggests limited social stratification. There are no clearly larger or more elaborate dwellings that would indicate elite residences. Burials are not located within the settlement itself. This separation suggests that Archaeum was a space for living and production, while funerary practices occurred elsewhere. The circular design of Archaeum has prompted speculation about symbolic meaning. While circular forms appear in many cultures, here the shape also serves practical purposes, maximizing enclosure efficiency and minimizing wall length relative to enclosed area. The alignment of Archaeum has been studied for possible astronomical significance. Some researchers suggest alignments with solar or lunar events, though these interpretations remain debated. What is clear is that the layout reflects careful measurement and planning. Archaeum was not an isolated site. It belonged to a network of similar circular settlements across the southern Urals and Kazakhstan. This pattern indicates shared architectural knowledge rather than local improvisation. The settlement was occupied for a relatively short period. Evidence suggests that Archaeum was deliberately abandoned and possibly burned, rather than gradually decaying through neglect. This abandonment was not chaotic. Valuable items appeared to have been removed, indicating planned departure rather than sudden destruction. Environmental factors may have contributed. Climate fluctuation, resource depletion, or shifts in social organization could have reduced the site's viability. The rediscovery of Archaeum in the late 20th century occurred during survey work ahead of reservoir construction. Its preservation was threatened before its significance was recognized. Modern excavation revealed the precision of its layout. The circular walls, radial houses, and drainage systems form a coherent whole, rather than a collection of ad hoc structures. Archaeum challenges the idea that early complex settlements required hierarchical states or monumental temples. Here, organization is expressed through planning and repetition rather than vertical display. The settlement demonstrates how geometry can structure social life. Movement, access, and visibility were shaped by form rather than by written rules. Archaeum's design emphasizes inward focus. the community faced itself rather than the surrounding landscape, reinforcing cohesion. The absence of monumental buildings does not imply simplicity. Complexity here lies in integration rather than scale. Archaeum represents a moment when Bronze Age societies experimented with enclosure, planning, and collective living on a large scale. Its circular form remains legible even after millennia, marking a deliberate approach to settlement design rather than organic growth. The site continues to inform discussions about early urban planning, social organization, and the role of geometry in human environments. Archaeum stands as a record of how communities shape space to support cooperation, production, and security without centralized architecture dominating the landscape. La Quemada. La Quemada is located in the state of Zacatecas, in north-central Mexico, set on a series of volcanic ridges overlooking broad valleys. The environment here is semi-arid, marked by rocky slopes, limited water sources, and long sightlines. This is not a landscape that easily supports dense populations without careful planning. Archaeologically, the site is identified as La Quemada. Its primary occupation dates roughly between 600 and 900 CE, during a period when northern and central Mesoamerica were connected through trade, migration, and shifting political networks. La Quemada occupies a fortified hilltop position. Stone terraces climb the slopes, supporting plazas, platforms, and buildings arranged across multiple levels. Rather than a single compact enclosure, the site spreads horizontally and vertically, adapting to the natural contours of the hill. The most visually striking feature is the extensive terracing system. These terraces were not agricultural in the traditional sense. Instead, they served as structural supports, creating flat surfaces for construction and stabilizing steep slopes. Stone stairways and causeways connect different parts of the site. These routes channel movement in controlled ways, guiding people along specific paths rather than allowing unrestricted access. Movement through La Quemada was deliberate and segmented. One of the central architectural elements is the Hall of Columns. This structure consists of rows of stone columns arranged in a rectangular plan, supporting what was likely a roofed space. The columns are evenly spaced, indicating measured planning rather than ad hoc construction. The function of the Hall of Columns remains debated. Its scale and layout suggest communal or administrative use rather than domestic occupation. It may have hosted gatherings, rituals, or elite activities. Nearby plazas open onto platforms and raised areas. These spaces vary in size, suggesting different types of use, rather than a single ceremonial function repeated throughout the site. Defensive features are prominent. Walls, narrow access points, and elevated positions limit approach routes. The hilltop location itself acts as a barrier, while built features enhance control over entry. Despite these defenses, La Quemada does not show evidence of a tightly enclosed city. Instead, it appears as a complex of activity zones connected through terraces and pathways. Residential areas are less clearly defined than ceremonial or administrative spaces. This has led to interpretations that La Quemada may not have housed a large permanent population, or that residential zones lie beyond the core monumental area. Water management was critical. Cisterns and channels collected and distributed rainwater, compensating for the lack of nearby rivers. These systems indicate planning for seasonal scarcity. Artifacts recovered from the site include ceramics, obsidian tools, and evidence of long-distance trade. Materials sourced from central Mexico and beyond suggest that La Quemada was connected to wider exchange networks. The site's cultural affiliation remains debated. Some researchers associate it with northern frontier groups, influenced by central Mexican traditions, while others see it as a local development responding to regional conditions. There's no clear evidence that La Quemada was controlled by a powerful centralized state. Architecture emphasizes coordination rather than monumental display associated with imperial authority. Burned layers found at the site indicate episodes of destruction or abandonment involving fire. Whether these resulted from conflict, ritual closure, or accidental events remains uncertain. The name La Quemada, meaning the burned one, reflects later interpretation rather than confirmed ancient identity. The original name and language of its builders are unknown. The site appears to have been abandoned around the 10th century CE. After this, it was not significantly reoccupied or rebuilt, allowing architectural features to remain visible. Environmental stress, shifting trade routes, or regional instability may have contributed to its decline. The exact cause is not fully understood. La Quemada's architecture reflects a response to marginal conditions. Rather than relying on fertile plains, its builders adapted to rugged terrain through terracing and controlled access. The emphasis on movement, elevation, and segmentation suggests that spatial organization played a key role in social structure. Unlike ceremonial centers dominated by temples or pyramids, La Quemada spreads importance across multiple structures and levels. This distributed layout implies shared functions rather than a single focal monument. The site's visibility across the surrounding landscape suggests symbolic presence as well as practical defense. It marked territory without enclosing it completely. La Quemada challenges simple classifications. It is neither a compact city nor a purely ceremonial center. It sits between categories, reflecting regional adaptation. Its construction required sustained labor and coordination, but not the kind of centralized control seen in later Mesoamerican states. The hilltop complex demonstrates how architecture can organize activity in difficult environments through layering rather than enclosure. La Quemada remains a key reference point for understanding northern Mesoamerican interaction zones, where ideas moved without uniform political control. Its terraces, halls, and causeways continue to define the ridge, preserving a record of how communities structured space, access, and cooperation under constraint. Cañada de la Virgen. Cañada de la Virgen is located in the central Mexican highlands of Guanajuato, set within a narrow valley surrounded by low hills and seasonal waterways. The landscape here is quieter and more contained than the open basins of central Mexico, defined by rolling terrain and controlled lines of sight rather than broad horizons. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Cañada de la Virgen. Its primary occupation dates from roughly 600 to 900 CE, overlapping with the later Classic and early post-Classic periods of Mesoamerican history. This places the site within a time of regional interaction rather than imperial dominance. Cañada de la Virgen is a planned ceremonial complex rather than a dense urban settlement. The site is composed of several large step platforms arranged along a linear axis that follows the natural contours of the valley. Architecture here works with the terrain rather than reshaping it completely. The most prominent structure is the House of the 13 Heavens, a stepped pyramid positioned at the center of the complex. Its placement establishes a visual and spatial anchor, visible from much of the surrounding valley floor. Unlike many Mesoamerican pyramids built in large population centers, this structure is isolated from extensive residential zones. This separation suggests that the site functioned primarily as a ceremonial and calendrical center, rather than as a civic capital. Orientation is central to understanding Cañada de la Virgen. The main structures are aligned with solar and lunar events, including solstices and equinoxes. These alignments are not approximate. They are precise enough to indicate careful observation and repeated measurement. Stairways and terraces guide movement upward and inward. Approach routes are deliberate, narrowing access and controlling how people encounter the architecture. The experience is sequential rather than immediate. The platforms are constructed from stone and earth, reinforced with retaining walls. Construction emphasizes mass and stability rather than fine stone carving. Surfaces were likely plastered originally, creating uniform planes of color and light. Open plazas between the platforms function as gathering spaces. Their size suggests participation by groups rather than individuals, but not at the scale of large urban ceremonies. The absence of defensive walls or fortifications indicates that protection was not a primary concern. Instead, placement within a sheltered valley and controlled access routes provided sufficient separation. Artifacts recovered from the site include ceramics, obsidian tools, and ritual objects. These finds point toward ceremonial use rather than domestic occupation. There's limited evidence of permanent housing within the core complex. Daily life likely occurred in smaller settlements nearby, with people traveling to the site for specific events. Water management played an important role. Channels and reservoir captured seasonal rainfall, ensuring availability during dry periods. This infrastructure supported gatherings without requiring constant habitation. The architectural language of Cañada de la Virgen differs from major central Mexican centers such as Teotihuacan or Tula. While influenced by broader Mesoamerican traditions, it reflects regional adaptation rather than direct control. The builders selected this location for visibility and alignment rather than for agricultural productivity. The valley functions as a contained observational space, suitable for tracking celestial movement. The site's use of elevation is restrained. Platforms rise enough to command attention without dominating the skyline. This balance suggests emphasis on observation rather than display. Cañada de la Virgen appears to have been used episodically. There's no evidence of continuous expansion or dense rebuilding. Instead, the architecture remains coherent and relatively unchanged over time. This stability suggests long-term adherence to a specific ritual and calendrical function rather than shifting political needs. The site's decline appears gradual. There's no clear evidence of violent destruction. Changing regional networks or population movement may have reduced its relevance. After abandonment, the structures remain visible, slowly weathering but retaining their form due to careful construction. Modern excavation has emphasized the site's astronomical significance, but its social role was likely broader. Ritual, timekeeping, and communal gathering were intertwined. The architecture organizes attention toward specific moments rather than constant activity. Meaning emerges through timing, alignment, and repetition. Cañada de la Virgen demonstrates how Mesoamerican societies use architecture to anchor cosmology into landscape without relying on large urban populations. The site reflects a model of ceremonial space that is focused, controlled, and integrated with natural form. Its structures do not impose themselves aggressively on the land. They align with it, using elevation and orientation to create order. Cañada de la Virgen stands as a reminder that complexity in ancient societies often took the form of precision rather than scale. The valley continues to frame the architecture, preserving relationships between stone, horizon, and movement that define the site's original function. Yaxchilan Lesser Structures. Yaxchilan is located deep within the tropical rainforest of southern Mexico, along a dramatic bend of the Usumacinta River near the modern border with Guatemala. The river forms a natural corridor through dense jungle, shaping movement, trade, and visibility. Access to the site is still primarily by boat, reinforcing how geography continues to define encounter. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Yaxchilan, a major classic Maya center occupied primarily between the 5th and 9th centuries CE. While Yaxchilan is best known for its carved lintels and monumental temples, much of the city's structure lies in its lesser buildings, platforms, terraces, stairways, and small enclosures that supported daily and ceremonial life. These lesser structures are distributed across uneven terrain, climbing ridges and descending toward the river. Rather than following a rigid grid, they adapt closely to the contours of the land. Platforms level small areas of slope, creating usable surfaces without reshaping the landscape entirely. Most of these structures are built from limestone blocks set in mortar, then faced with plaster. Their walls are thinner and lower than those of the main temples, indicating different functional priorities. Height and visibility were reserved for specific buildings, while supporting spaces remained subdued. Residential platforms form clusters on terraces above and below the monumental core. These platforms supported perishable superstructures made of wood and thatch, which have not survived. What remains are stone foundations outlining where households once stood. The distribution of residential platforms reflects social organization. Proximity to the central plazas correlates with status, but differences are gradual rather than extreme. There's no sharp architectural divide between elite and non-elite zones. Small shrines and minor temples are interspersed among residential areas. These structures often face inward toward courtyards rather than outward toward the landscape. Their scale suggests localized ritual use rather than citywide ceremony. Stairways are a defining element of Yaxchilan's lesser architecture. Narrow, steep steps connect terraces vertically, controlling movement between levels. These stairways are functional rather than ceremonial, guiding everyday circulation through the city. Retaining walls stabilize slopes and define edges of platforms. Their construction reflects practical engineering, designed to prevent erosion during heavy rains, rather than to impress visually. Drainage channels are integrated throughout the site. Rainwater is directed away from platforms and stairways, reducing damage in a region with intense seasonal rainfall. These systems are understated but essential. Unlike the main temples, the lesser structures lack elaborate carvings or inscriptions. Their meaning lies in placement and repetition rather than iconography. They create the framework within which monumental buildings operate. Movement through Yachalan depends on these supporting structures. Approaching a major temple requires navigating terraces, stairways, and narrow paths, shaping experience through gradual ascent rather than direct approach. The lesser structures also mediate between the city and the jungle. Beyond the built terraces, forest rises quickly. Architecture ends abruptly, emphasizing the boundary between cultivated space and surrounding wilderness. Some smaller platforms appear to have served administrative or storage functions. Their location near plazas but away from temples suggests roles connected to logistics rather than ritual display. Construction quality varies. Some platforms are carefully finished, while others are more utilitarian. This variation reflects functional diversity rather than chronological decay. The river-facing side of Yachalan includes docks and access points integrated into the lower terraces. These features connected the city to river traffic, facilitating movement of goods and people. The lesser structures show evidence of repair and modification over time. Walls were reinforced, platforms expanded, and stairways adjusted. This indicates long-term occupation and active maintenance. Despite these changes, the overall layout remained coherent. New construction respected existing paths and terraces, suggesting continuity in spatial planning. The absence of defensive walls around residential zones indicates that security relied more on geography and political relationships than on fortification. Yachalan's lesser structures do not function independently. They support ceremonial, political, and domestic activities by organizing space at a human scale. They also regulate visibility. From most residential terraces, monumental temples are visible, but not overwhelming. This balance reinforces hierarchy without isolating daily life from civic identity. The city's rhythm emerges from repetition, platform after platform, stairway after stairway, rather than from singular monuments. These structures absorb the daily wear of living, movement, and weather, allowing the carved temples to stand apart as focal points. When Yachalan was abandoned in the late Classic period, perishable buildings decayed quickly. The stone platforms remained, anchoring memory of occupation even as jungle reclaimed the site. Modern exploration often focuses on the dramatic carvings, but understanding Yachalan requires attention to these quieter elements. The lesser structures reveal how a Maya city functioned beyond ceremony, how people moved, lived, stored, and gathered between monumental moments. They formed the connective tissue of the city, translating political and ritual order into everyday spatial experience. Yachalan's terraces and platforms remain fixed in place, shaping paths through forest and ruin, preserving the outline of daily life long after voices have faded. Bandelier stone structures. Bandelier is located in northern New Mexico, within a landscape shaped by volcanic activity, erosion, and long seasonal contrasts. The site lies along the canyons and mesas carved from soft volcanic tuff, particularly within Frijoles Canyon. This environment provided both opportunity and limitation, shaping how people built and lived over centuries. Archaeologically, the area is identified as Bandelier, associated primarily with ancestral Puebloan communities. Occupation intensified between roughly the 12th and 16th centuries CE, though earlier use of the region is evident. The defining feature of Bandelier is the integration of architecture with the canyon walls. Rather than constructing entirely freestanding buildings, inhabitants carved dwellings directly into the volcanic tuff. These rock-cut rooms, known as cavates, appear in clusters along cliff faces, often arranged in tiers. The tuff itself is relatively soft when exposed, allowing it to be shaped with stone tools. Builders hollowed out interior spaces, smoothed walls, and cut openings for doors and ventilation. The resulting rooms are compact but stable, benefiting from the insulating properties of the rock. Cavates were not isolated units. Many were connected by footpaths, ladders, and hand and toe holds carved into the cliff. These access features controlled movement, limiting approach to those familiar with the terrain. Along the canyon floor and on adjacent mesas, freestanding stone structures were also built. These include room blocks, storage spaces, and kivas. Stone masonry here is functional rather than decorative, using small blocks set in mud mortar. The relationship between cliff dwellings and ground-level structures is significant. Cavates appear to have served primarily as living or storage spaces, while communal and ceremonial activity took place in constructed buildings below. Kivas, subterranean ceremonial chambers, are found throughout the area. Their placement within village clusters indicates that ritual activity was integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. Water availability shaped settlement patterns. Frijoles Creek provided a reliable water source, while check dams and terraces managed runoff and reduced erosion. These features supported small-scale agriculture in an otherwise challenging environment. Agricultural fields were located on mesa tops and canyon bottoms. Crops such as maize, beans, and squash were cultivated using dry farming techniques adapted to limited rainfall. The stone structures at Bandelier emphasize moderation rather than monumentality. Walls are low, rooms are small, and spaces are closely packed. Architecture here prioritizes efficiency and protection over display. There's no evidence of large defensive walls. Security relied on location, visibility, and controlled access routes rather than fortification. Cliff dwellings provided natural elevation and concealment. Movement through Bandelier is vertical as much as horizontal. Paths climb canyon walls, descend into courtyards, and weave between rock-cut and constructed spaces. This verticality shapes social interaction and daily routines. Artifacts recovered from the site include pottery, stone tools, bone implements, and woven materials. These reflect domestic life, craft production, and local trade rather than elite consumption. Evidence of long-distance exchange exists in the form of obsidian and shell, indicating that Bandelier was connected to broader regional networks, despite its remote appearance. Over time, occupation patterns shifted. Some cavités were abandoned, while others were reused. Structures were modified, entrances reshaped, and rooms repurposed, indicating flexible use rather than rigid planning. The population eventually declined in the late 16th century. Environmental stress, prolonged drought, and social change contributed to migration toward larger pueblos along the Rio Grande. When residents left, the stone and rock-cut structures remained. Unlike perishable buildings, these spaces persisted, gradually empty but largely intact. Spanish contact altered regional settlement patterns, but Bandelier itself was not heavily reoccupied. This limited later disturbance, allowing archaeological features to remain visible. Modern preservation has stabilized many structures, but their form reflects original choices rather than reconstruction. Walls remain low, rooms remain modest, and access remains deliberate. Bandelier demonstrates an architectural strategy based on adaptation rather than transformation. Builders worked within the limits of their environment instead of reshaping it extensively. The stone structures do not impose order from above. They follow canyon curves, cliff lines, and water courses, embedding human presence within existing form. Domestic, ceremonial, and agricultural spaces are closely interwoven. There is no clear separation between sacred and everyday activity. This integration reflects a worldview in which place, practice, and community were inseparable. The architecture records repeated decisions made over generations, each responding to environment, resources, and social need. Bandelier's stone structures show how endurance can be achieved through restraint, flexibility, and careful placement rather than scale. They remain part of the canyon landscape, continuing to shape movement, visibility, and interpretation long after daily life has ended. Ingapirca Lesser Structures. Ingapirca is located in the southern highlands of Ecuador. Set on a windswept plateau above river valleys and agricultural terraces, the elevation is high, the air thin, and the climate variable. Frost, rain, and strong sunlight shape both the landscape and the way stone endures over time. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Ingapirca, the most significant Inca complex in Ecuador. While the site is often discussed in relation to its prominent ceremonial buildings, much of Ingapirca's structure lies in its lesser architecture: terraces, retaining walls, platforms, and service buildings that supported daily and ritual activity. These lesser structures spread outward from the central ceremonial core. Rather than forming a dense city, Ingapirca is composed of clusters of stone features connected by paths and terraces. Architecture here is horizontal and layered, responding directly to slope and exposure. Terracing is a defining feature. Stone. Retaining walls hold back earth, creating level surfaces for movement, construction, and limited cultivation. These terraces stabilize the plateau and prevent erosion in an environment prone to heavy rain. The stonework of the lesser structures differs from the finely fitted masonry of ceremonial buildings. Stones are smaller, more irregular, and set with practical efficiency rather than precision. This contrast reflects functional hierarchy rather than chronological difference. Residential platforms appear across the site. These platforms supported perishable structures made of wood, reed, and thatch. Though the superstructures are gone, the stone bases define the spatial footprint of living areas. The placement of these platforms suggests organized planning. They are positioned to take advantage of sunlight and shelter while maintaining proximity to ceremonial and administrative zones. Movement through Ingapirka is guided by narrow paths and stepped routes. These passages regulate circulation, preventing random access and directing people along established lines. Walls serve multiple roles. Some define edges of terraces, others enclose courtyards or separate functional zones. None are monumental, but collectively they structure space with clarity. Water management is integrated throughout the complex. Channels direct runoff away from walls and paths, protecting foundations from erosion. In a highland environment, controlling water is essential to architectural survival. Unlike major Inca urban centers such as Cusco, Ingapirka does not show extensive evidence of large residential populations. The lesser structures suggest episodic occupation rather than continuous dense habitation. This pattern aligns with Ingapirka's interpretation as a regional administrative and ceremonial center rather than a permanent city. People likely arrived for specific events, labor obligations, or seasonal activities. Some lesser buildings appear to have served storage functions. Their enclosed forms and placement away from ceremonial spaces suggest use for supplies rather than ritual. The architecture reflects Inca strategies of integration rather than replacement. Ingapirka was built in a region already inhabited by local Cañari populations. Rather than erasing earlier presence, Inca construction incorporated and reorganized existing landscapes. Lesser structures may have supported both Inca administrators and local communities, creating shared spaces rather than exclusive zones. The absence of large defensive works indicates that control relied on organization and presence rather than fortification. Visibility across the plateau provided natural surveillance. Construction materials were sourced locally. Stone was abundant, but shaping it required labor. The consistency of masonry indicates trained builders operating within established norms. Maintenance would have been ongoing. Terraces require constant repair, and paths need clearing. The continued usability of these lesser structures implies organized upkeep. After the Spanish conquest, Ingapirka's role changed rapidly. The site was not extensively rebuilt, and many perishable structures disappeared quickly. Stone terraces and walls remained, preserving the underlying layout even as surface activity ceased. Modern excavation has focused primarily on ceremonial buildings, but surveys show that the lesser structures form the majority of the complex. These features reveal how Ingapirka functioned day to day, how people moved, stored goods, managed water, and interacted beyond ritual moments. The lesser structures do not compete visually with the ceremonial core. They support it, extending function across the landscape without drawing attention to themselves. This relationship reflects a broader Inca architectural principle: hierarchy expressed through precision and placement rather than sheer size. The plateau setting reinforces this logic. Architecture works with wind, slope, and visibility instead of imposing rigid geometry. Ingapirka's lesser structures demonstrate how imperial systems operated through infrastructure as much as symbolism. They anchored authority in routine activity, paths walked, terraces maintained, walls repaired, rather than in spectacle alone. These stone features remain embedded in the highland landscape, continuing to define movement and space long after roofs and rituals have vanished. They preserve the practical framework that allowed Ingapirka's ceremonial and administrative functions to exist at all. El Jamal Basalt City. El Jamal lies in northern Jordan, on the edge of the Horan volcanic plateau. The landscape here is defined by black basalt stone, sparse vegetation, and wide horizons. There are no forests and little natural timber. What dominates the environment is stone, dense, heavy, and difficult to work. Archaeologically, the site is identified as El Jamal. Occupation spans several periods, from Nabatean foundations through Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic phases, with the city reaching its greatest extent between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE. Um, El Jamal is not a ceremonial center or fortress. It's a town built almost entirely from basalt, including houses, streets, stairways, towers, and churches. Unlike cities constructed with mixed materials, here stone is used for everything, from walls and roofs to doors and lintels. The use of basalt shaped every architectural decision. Basalt is extremely hard and heavy, making it difficult to cut precisely. Instead of finely dressed blocks, builders relied on thick walls, large slabs, and stacked construction. Stability was achieved through mass rather than refinement. Residential buildings dominate the site. Many structures rise 2 or 3 stories high, an unusual feature for ancient towns built without timber reinforcement. Stone staircases were integrated directly into walls, allowing vertical movement without wooden supports. Roofs were constructed from long basalt slabs laid across walls. These slabs are massive, requiring coordinated labor to position. Their survival indicates careful engineering and balanced load distribution. Streets at El Jamal are narrow and irregular, shaped by gradual expansion rather than a formal grid. Buildings press close together, creating shaded corridors that reduce heat and wind exposure. Water management was essential in this dry environment. Cisterns were carved into the ground or built into courtyards, collecting seasonal rainfall from roofs and streets. These systems allowed long-term occupation despite the absence of nearby rivers. Public buildings are present but understated. Churches, administrative structures, and communal spaces blend into the urban fabric rather than standing apart as monumental focal points. Defensive walls are minimal. The town relied more on its remote location and the durability of its construction than on heavy fortification. Basalt towers appear throughout the site. Some may have served as watch points, storage spaces, or status markers. Their function varies, but their presence adds vertical emphasis to the townscape. The repetition of similar house forms suggests standardized building knowledge. Construction techniques were shared, indicating skilled local builders rather than imported specialists. Despite its size, El Jamal shows little evidence of elite palaces or sharply segregated districts. Housing quality varies, but differences are gradual rather than extreme. This suggests a community organized around shared infrastructure rather than strict hierarchy. Authority existed, but it was not expressed through architectural dominance. The city's growth appears incremental. Buildings were added, modified, and rebuilt over time, adapting to changing needs rather than following a single master plan. When political and economic networks shifted in the early Islamic period, El Jamal was gradually abandoned. There is little evidence of violent destruction. As population declined, roofs collapsed inward, but walls remained standing. Basalt's durability preserved building outlines long after occupation ended. Unlike mud brick cities that erode into low mounds, El Jamal remains legible. Streets, doorways, staircases, and room divisions are still visible. This preservation allows close study of daily urban life rather than monumental display. The city records how people lived, moved, stored water, and shared space. El Jamal demonstrates an architectural response shaped almost entirely by material constraint. With no wood and little soil, builders turned stone into a complete urban system. The result is a city that feels heavy, enclosed, and enduring, built to last rather than to impress. Its architecture reflects adaptation rather than innovation for its own sake. Solutions are repeated because they work. The town shows how urban life can flourish without grand monuments, relying instead on infrastructure, repetition, and material intelligence. El Jamal stands as a record of continuity across empires, with architecture absorbing cultural change without radical transformation. The basalt city remains embedded in the volcanic plain, its dark stone structures still defining space and movement centuries after abandonment. El Paraíso Early Complex. El Paraíso is located on the central coast of Peru, just north of modern Lima, positioned between the Pacific shoreline and the lower river valleys that cut through the coastal desert. The landscape here is dry and open, shaped by wind, sand, and seasonal water flow from the Andes. This environment supported early settlement only where planning and coordination made it possible. Archaeologically, the site is identified as El Paraíso. Its main occupation dates to roughly 3000 to 1800 BCE, placing it among the earliest large-scale architectural complexes in the Americas. El Paraíso belongs to the same broad cultural horizon as Caral, Banduria, and other early coastal centers, yet it developed with its own spatial logic. El Paraíso is composed of a group of massive platform mounds arranged around open courtyards and plazas. These platforms are rectangular and elongated rather than pyramidal, forming long-step structures that define space through alignment and enclosure. The scale of construction is substantial. Individual platforms rise several meters high and extend across large areas. Their size indicates sustained labor over long periods rather than rapid or episodic building. Construction methods relied on stone and earth. Walls were built from roughly shaped stone set in clay mortar, with interior fill composed of rubble and soil. This approach prioritized volume and stability over fine surface finish. The arrangement of platforms suggests intentional planning. Structures are aligned relative to one another, creating corridors, courtyards, and controlled access points. Movement through the complex is guided rather than open. Unlike later Andean ceremonial centers, El Paraíso does not feature finely carved stone or iconographic decoration. Architecture here communicates through mass, repetition, and placement rather than imagery. Sunken spaces appear between some platforms. These areas likely functioned as gathering zones, separating participants from surrounding activity while maintaining visibility toward elevated structures. There is limited evidence of permanent residential occupation within the monumental core. Domestic activity appears to have taken place nearby rather than on the platforms themselves. This separation suggests that El Paraíso functioned primarily as a communal or ceremonial center, rather than as a dense urban settlement. People likely traveled to the site for specific events or coordinated labor. Marine resources played a central role in sustaining construction. Fish remains, shell, and other coastal materials indicate reliance on ocean-based subsistence rather than intensive agriculture alone. Cotton was also important. Evidence suggests its use in nets, textiles, and cordage, linking El Paraíso to broader coastal production networks. The absence of defensive architecture is notable. There are no walls, bastions, or controlled gateways designed for protection. The complex was not built with conflict in mind. This lack of fortification aligns with other early coastal sites, suggesting that social organization relied on cooperation and shared interest rather than coercion. The platforms at El Paraíso were built incrementally. Earlier phases were expanded and modified, creating layered architecture rather than replacing structures entirely. This process reflects continuity. Each generation added to existing forms, reinforcing shared memory through physical accumulation. There's little evidence of social stratification expressed architecturally. Platforms vary in size, but no single structure dominates the complex completely. Leadership, if present, was not displayed through monumental separation or elite residences within the core area. El Paraíso's proximity to the coast distinguishes it from inland valley centers. This position allowed direct access to marine resources while maintaining connections to inland exchange routes. The site's long-term use suggests stable social networks capable of sustaining large construction projects without centralized state authority. Eventually, activity at El Paraíso declined. Environmental change, shifting resource availability, or the emergence of other regional centers may have contributed. When occupation ended, structures were left standing. Over time, sand and erosion softened edges but preserved overall form. Modern excavation has revealed the clarity of El Paraíso's layout, highlighting planning rather than improvisation. The complex demonstrates that early monumentality in the Andes did not depend on kingship, writing, or warfare. Instead, it emerged through repeated cooperation, shared scheduling, and long-term commitment to place. El Paraíso reflects an architectural language focused on enclosure and movement, rather than vertical dominance. Its platforms frame space rather than overshadow it, guiding attention horizontally across the complex. The site shows how early societies used architecture to organize gathering, labor, and ritual without overt symbols of power. El Paraíso remains a key reference point for understanding how complex construction emerged along the Peruvian coast. Its stone and earth structures continue to define space, recording decisions made thousands of years before later Andean civilizations. The complex stands as evidence that early communal architecture could be extensive, coordinated, and enduring without formal state systems. Barnhouse Settlement. Barnhouse Settlement is located on mainland Orkney. beside the southern shore of the Loch of Harry. The surrounding landscape is open and windswept, defined by low rolling land, shallow water, and long sightlines. Stone dominates the terrain, while timber is scarce, shaping how people built and lived. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Barnhouse Settlement. It dates to roughly 3200–3000 BCE, placing it firmly within the Neolithic period and contemporary with nearby ceremonial monuments such as Maeshowe and the Stones of Stennis. Barnhouse is a small village rather than a ceremonial complex. It consists of a cluster of stone-built houses arranged loosely around open space, without rigid enclosure or defensive boundaries. The settlement appears planned, but not tightly regulated. The houses at Barnhouse are rectangular with rounded corners, built from stacked stone slabs without mortar. Walls are thick, providing insulation against cold winds and seasonal temperature change. Each house contains a central hearth, stone-built furniture, and internal partitions. Beds, shelves, and work surfaces are integrated into the walls, fixing the interior layout and shaping daily routines. Roofing materials have not survived, but the structures likely used timber beams, turf, and thatch. The stone walls provided the primary load-bearing support. Unlike Skara Barnhouse houses are more widely spaced. This spacing allows movement between structures without covered passageways, indicating a different approach to circulation and exposure. One building at Barnhouse stands apart. Structure 8 is larger than the other houses and more carefully constructed. Its size and placement suggest a communal or ceremonial function rather than domestic use. Structure 8 contains a large central hearth and heavier stonework. Its form resembles domestic architecture, but its scale and isolation imply that it served a shared purpose. The presence of a communal building alongside domestic houses suggests that social life at Barnhouse included collective activities beyond household units. Stone tools, pottery, and animal remains recovered from the site indicate everyday domestic activity. Diet included cattle, sheep, fish, and cultivated crops, reflecting a mixed farming economy. Water from the nearby loch supported both livestock and limited agriculture. The settlement's placement balances access to water with protection from flooding. There's no evidence of defensive architecture. Barnhouse relied on openness and community, rather than walls or barriers. Paths between houses are informal. Movement appears flexible rather than strictly controlled, suggesting a social structure based on cooperation rather than hierarchy. Burials are not found within the settlement itself. Funerary activity likely occurred at nearby monuments, separating daily life from ritual treatment of the dead. The settlement shows signs of long-term occupation. Houses were repaired and rebuilt, with stone reused rather than discarded. This indicates continuity rather than short-term use. Barnhouse's proximity to major ceremonial sites is significant. The settlement sits within a ritual landscape, yet it remains firmly domestic in character. This proximity suggests that people who participated in large-scale ceremonial construction also lived in modest, practical dwellings. Barnhouse does not display sharp social stratification. House sizes are similar, and material culture is evenly distributed. The larger communal structure does not dominate the settlement. It coexists with houses rather than overshadowing them. The village layout allows visibility across open space, reinforcing shared awareness rather than isolation. Barnhouse architecture emphasizes durability and routine. Stone walls, fixed furniture, and repeated house plans reflect stability rather than experimentation. The settlement was eventually abandoned, possibly as populations shifted or new social arrangements emerged. There is no evidence of violent destruction. After abandonment, the houses collapsed gradually. Stone remained visible, preserving outlines of domestic space. Modern excavation has revealed how clearly the settlement's layout can be read, even without standing walls. Barnhouse offers a contrast to monumental Neolithic architecture. Here, daily life is expressed through repetition, not scale. The settlement shows how ordinary domestic structures supported extraordinary ceremonial activity elsewhere in the landscape. It demonstrates that Neolithic communities balanced ritual ambition with practical living. Barnhouse records how people organized households, shared space, and maintained continuity over generations. Its remains preserve a quiet form of architecture, functional, communal, and closely tied to landscape. The settlement continues to define movement across the ground. marking where people lived rather than where they gathered ceremonially. Barnhouse stands as a reminder that the foundations of complex societies are often built in modest, repeated forms. Queen Hill Chambered Cairn. Queen Hill rises gently above the surrounding farmland of mainland Orkney. From a distance, the hill appears unremarkable, shaped by wind and low vegetation. There are no standing stones or visible walls to announce what lies beneath. The monument is concealed by the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Queen Hill Chambered Cairn. It dates to around 3000 BCE and belongs to the tradition of Neolithic chambered cairns found across Orkney. These structures were built long before metal tools or written records, relying entirely on stone, planning, and shared labor. The cairn is entered through a low, narrow passage cut into the hillside. Entry requires deliberate movement. One must crouch and adjust posture, slowing the body before reaching the interior. This physical constraint is part of the architecture, shaping how the space is experienced. The passage leads into a central chamber from which several small side cells extend. These side chambers are arranged symmetrically, each just large enough to contain a human body. The scale is intimate rather than expansive. The walls are constructed from flat stone slabs carefully stacked without mortar. Corbelled roofing draws the weight inward and upward, distributing pressure across the structure. This technique allowed the cairn to endure for millennia beneath earth and stone. Unlike large passage tombs such as Maisho, Queen Hill is compact. It does not aim to impress through size. Its complexity lies in internal organization rather than external visibility. Excavations at Queen Hill revealed an unusual find. Alongside human remains, archaeologists discovered the skulls of dogs placed deliberately within the chambers. These skulls were not scattered or accidental. They were positioned with care. The presence of dog remains suggests symbolic association rather than disposal. Dogs may have held a particular role within Neolithic society, companions, protectors, or symbolic guides. Human remains found within the cairn were disarticulated. This indicates that bodies were not placed intact, but rather introduced after decomposition elsewhere. This practice reflects collective burial rather than individual interment. The cairn was reused repeatedly over generations, each use added to the existing arrangement rather than replacing it. This continuity transformed the structure into a cumulative space of memory. There is no evidence of grave goods such as weapons or ornaments that would indicate social hierarchy. Treatment of the dead appears consistent, reinforcing a collective identity. The choice to place the cairn within a hill rather than on a ridge reduces its visibility. This suggests that access was restricted to those who knew its location rather than intended for public display. The interior chambers are dark even during daylight. Light does not penetrate beyond the entrance. This darkness isolates the interior from daily cycles, creating a distinct spatial condition. The controlled interior environment emphasizes separation between the living world and the space of the dead. Entry is intentional and temporary. Construction of the cairn required quarrying, transport, and precise placement of large stone slabs. This effort was invested in a space rarely entered rather than frequently used. Such investment suggests that the cairn held long-term significance beyond immediate utility. It was built to persist rather than to accommodate frequent activity. Queen Hill is part of a wider funerary landscape. Other chambered cairns lie within walking distance, forming a network of burial sites rather than a single focal monument. This distribution indicates shared practices across communities rather than centralized authority directing construction. The cairn's form prioritizes internal order. The symmetry of chambers, the alignment of stones, and the controlled passage all reflect deliberate planning. There's no decoration inside the cairn. Meaning is carried through placement, repetition, and association rather than imagery. The presence of dogs alongside humans suggests relationships extending beyond life, whether symbolic, ritual, or practical. This inclusion reflects a worldview in which humans and animals were closely linked. The cairn remained sealed for long periods. Opening it required effort, suggesting that access was limited to specific occasions rather than routine visits. When use eventually ceased, the cairn was left intact. Earth and vegetation covered the structure, preserving it beneath the hill. Unlike monuments that dominate their surroundings, Queen Hill withdraws into the landscape. Its presence is subtle, revealed only through entry. This restraint contrasts with later monumental architecture. Here, significance is concentrated inward rather than broadcast outward. Queen Hill demonstrates that Neolithic architecture could be introspective. Power and meaning were not always expressed through scale or visibility. The cairn records how communities understood death, continuity, and belonging across generations. Its chambers preserve a pattern of use shaped by repetition rather than innovation. The structure endures because it was designed to remain closed, stable, and protected from exposure. Queen Hill continues to define a relationship between stone, body, and memory that unfolds slowly through careful entry and controlled space. Queen Hill Chambered Cairn. Queen Hill rises gently above the surrounding farmland of mainland Orkney. From a distance, the hill appears unremarkable, shaped by wind and low vegetation. There are no standing stones or visible walls to announce what lies beneath. The monument is concealed by the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Queen Hill Chambered Cairn. It dates to around 3000 BCE and belongs to the tradition of Neolithic chambered cairns found across Orkney. These structures were built long before metal tools or written records, relying entirely on stone, planning, and shared labor. The cairn is entered through a low, narrow passage cut into the hillside. Entry requires deliberate movement. One must crouch and adjust posture, slowing the body before reaching the interior. This physical constraint is part of the architecture, shaping how the space is experienced. The passage leads into a central chamber from which several small side cells extend. These side chambers are arranged symmetrically, each just large enough to contain a human body. The scale is intimate rather than expansive. The walls are constructed from flat stone slabs carefully stacked without mortar. Corbelled roofing draws the weight inward and upward, distributing pressure across the structure. This technique allowed the cairn to endure for millennia beneath earth and stone. Unlike large passage tombs such as Maisho, Queen Hill is compact. It does not aim to impress through size. Its complexity lies in internal organization rather than external visibility. Excavations at Queen Hill revealed an unusual find. Alongside human remains, archaeologists discovered the skulls of dogs placed deliberately within the chambers. These skulls were not scattered or accidental. They were positioned with care. The presence of dog remains suggests symbolic association rather than disposal. Dogs may have held a particular role within Neolithic society, companions, protectors, or symbolic guides. Human remains found within the cairn were disarticulated. This indicates that bodies were not placed intact, but rather introduced after decomposition elsewhere. This practice reflects collective burial rather than individual interment. The cairn was reused repeatedly over generations, each use added to the existing arrangement rather than replacing it. This continuity transformed the structure into a cumulative space of memory. There is no evidence of grave goods such as weapons or ornaments that would indicate social hierarchy. Treatment of the dead appears consistent, reinforcing a collective identity. The choice to place the cairn within a hill rather than on a ridge reduces its visibility. This suggests that access was restricted to those who knew its location rather than intended for public display. The interior chambers are dark even during daylight. Light does not penetrate beyond the entrance. This darkness isolates the interior from daily cycles, creating a distinct spatial condition. The controlled interior environment emphasizes separation between the living world and the space of the dead. Entry is intentional and temporary. Construction of the cairn required quarrying, transport, and precise placement of large stone slabs. This effort was invested in a space rarely entered rather than frequently used. Such investment suggests that the cairn held long-term significance beyond immediate utility. It was built to persist rather than to accommodate frequent activity. Queen Hill is part of a wider funerary landscape. Other chambered cairns lie within walking distance, forming a network of burial sites rather than a single focal monument. This distribution indicates shared practices across communities rather than centralized authority directing construction. The cairn's form prioritizes internal order. The symmetry of chambers, the alignment of stones, and the controlled passage all reflect deliberate planning. There's no decoration inside the cairn. Meaning is carried through placement, repetition, and association rather than imagery. The presence of dogs alongside humans suggests relationships extending beyond life. Whether symbolic, ritual, or practical, this inclusion reflects a worldview in which humans and animals were closely linked. The cairn remained sealed for long periods. Opening it required effort, suggesting that access was limited to specific occasions rather than routine visits. When use eventually ceased, the cairn was left intact. Earth and vegetation covered the structure, preserving it beneath the hill. Unlike monuments that dominate their surroundings, Queen Hill withdraws into the landscape. Its presence is subtle, revealed only through entry. This restraint contrasts with later monumental architecture. Here, significance is concentrated inward rather than broadcast outward. Queen Hill demonstrates that Neolithic architecture could be introspective. Power and meaning were not always expressed through scale or visibility. The cairn records how communities understood death, continuity, and belonging across generations. Its chambers preserve a pattern of use shaped by repetition rather than innovation. The structure endures because it was designed to remain closed, stable, and protected from exposure. Queen Hill continues to define a relationship between stone, body, and memory that unfolds slowly through careful entry and controlled space. Pen y Werlad Long Cairn. Pen y Werlad lies on the eastern edge of the Black Mountains in southeast Wales, set above the Usk Valley on a high limestone ridge. The ground here is uneven and exposed, shaped by wind, rain, and thin soils. Visibility stretches across the valley, but the cairn itself sits low against the slope, blending into the landscape rather than standing apart from it. Archaeologically, the monument is identified as Pen y Werlad Long Cairn. It dates to the early Neolithic period, around 3700–3600 BCE, placing it among the earliest monumental stone structures in Britain. Its construction marks a clear shift from mobile lifeways toward permanent engagement with place. Pen y Werlad is a long cairn rather than a passage tomb. Its form is elongated, originally covered by a mound of stone and earth, extending lengthwise across the ridge. Unlike later circular cairns, this shape emphasizes direction and alignment rather than central focus. At the eastern end of the cairn is a stone-built chamber. This chamber is formed from large upright slabs supporting capstones, creating a confined interior space. Entry is low and narrow, requiring deliberate movement and controlled access. The chamber is not designed for repeated entry by many people at once. Its scale limits occupation to a few individuals, reinforcing the idea of selective access rather than communal gathering. Excavations at Pen y Werlad revealed human remains placed within the chamber, along with the animal bones and small artifacts. The human remains were disarticulated, indicating that bodies were not placed intact but introduced after decomposition elsewhere. This pattern reflects collective burial practices. The cairn functioned as a repository for the dead over time, rather than as a single-use tomb. The mound itself was constructed from locally sourced stone. Builders gathered material from the surrounding hillside, shaping the cairn from what was immediately available. This choice anchors the monument physically and symbolically to its location. The long cairn form creates a clear division between the chambered end and the body of the mound. This separation emphasizes the chamber as a focal point while maintaining the mass of the cairn as a stabilizing element. Unlike later monuments that incorporate elaborate stone art, Pen y Werlad is undecorated. Meaning is carried through form, placement, and use rather than visual symbolism. The cairn's position on a ridge provides broad views, yet the chamber faces inward rather than outward. Attention is directed toward the interior rather than the surrounding landscape. This inward focus suggests that the cairn's significance was tied to containment and memory rather than visibility or display. Construction required coordination. Moving large slabs into position without metal tools demand planning, shared labor, and repeated effort. The cairn was not built quickly. The effort invested in a structure used intermittently underscores its long-term importance. The cairn was intended to endure, not to serve daily needs. Pen y Werlad is part of a wider tradition of long cairns across Wales and Western Britain. These monuments share similar forms and burial practices, indicating shared cultural understanding rather than isolated innovation. The cairn likely functioned within a network of sites marking territory, ancestry, and continuity. It was one node in a landscape shaped by movement and memory. There is no evidence of social hierarchy expressed through burial goods. Treatment of remains appears consistent, suggesting that identity was collective rather than individual. The cairn was revisited over generations. Each deposition reinforced connection to the past, rather than introducing change. Eventually, use ceased. The cairn remained in place, gradually losing its covering stones and earth through erosion and later disturbance. Despite this loss, the chamber survives, preserving the original structure and orientation. The monument does not dominate its environment. It rests within it, relying on proximity rather than prominence. Penny Werlaud demonstrates an early architectural response to permanence. Stone was used to fix memory into the landscape at a time when farming communities were still newly established. The cairn shows how early Neolithic groups invested effort in places associated with death rather than daily life. Its long-form records a way of thinking about time as extended and cumulative, not momentary. Penny Werlaud preserves a quiet architectural language, linear, contained, and restrained. The monument continues to mark the ridge, shaping how the landscape is read even without visible superstructure. It stands as evidence that early monumentality was often subtle, embedded in terrain rather than raised above it. The cairn reflects a worldview in which continuity mattered more than spectacle. Its stones remain aligned as they were placed, maintaining relationships defined thousands of years ago. Penny Werlaud holds its meaning through persistence rather than presence, offering a record of how early communities anchored identity in land and stone. Kukuteni Tripilia Megasettlement. Across the rolling plains of present-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, traces of settlements appear that do not resemble villages, towns, or early cities in the familiar sense. From the air, they form vast circular patterns, rings within rings, stretching across hundreds of hectares. These are the mega-settlements of the Kukuteni Tripilia cultural tradition. Archaeologically, this tradition is identified as the Kukuteni Tripilia culture, active roughly between 4800 and 3000 BCE. Within this long span, some settlements reach sizes unprecedented for their time, with estimated populations in the tens of thousands. The landscape is open and fertile, shaped by river systems and deep soils suitable for early agriculture. There are no natural barriers such as cliffs or narrow valleys. The decision to build large, organized settlements here required intentional planning rather than reliance on terrain. Tripilia megasettlements were laid out in concentric rings. Houses formed circular bands around central open areas, with radial paths connecting inner and outer zones. This geometry is consistent across multiple sites, suggesting shared planning principles rather than accidental growth. Individual houses were built from timber frames packed with clay, creating sturdy but perishable structures. Floors were often plastered and walls painted. Though little survives above ground, magnetic surveys revealed dense and regular patterns beneath the soil. One of the most striking features of these settlements is repetition. Thousands of houses follow similar dimensions and orientation. This uniformity suggests standardized construction practices and shared social norms. There's little evidence of monumental buildings dominating the centers. Instead of temples or palaces, central areas appear open, possibly used for gatherings, movement, or shared activities. The absence of defensive walls is notable. Despite their size, these settlements do not appear fortified. This suggests that security depended on social cohesion or regional stability rather than physical barriers. Agriculture formed the economic base. Residents cultivated cereals and legumes and kept domesticated animals. The surrounding land could support large populations, but doing so required coordination across wide areas. Pottery is abundant and highly decorated. The intricate designs reflect aesthetic traditions shared across regions. These vessels were used domestically rather than reserved for elite contexts. Social hierarchy is difficult to detect archaeologically. House sizes are broadly similar, and there's no clear evidence of elite residences or segregated districts. This raises questions about how such large communities organize themselves. Decision-making may have been distributed rather than centralized. One of the most debated aspects of Tripilia settlements is their destruction by fire. Many houses show evidence of deliberate burning at the end of their use cycle. These burnings were not random disasters. The intensity and consistency suggest intentional acts carried out repeatedly over generations. The reasons remain uncertain. Burning may have been ritual, practical, or symbolic, perhaps marking the end of a household's life before rebuilding elsewhere. After burning, houses were often rebuilt nearby rather than on the same spot, gradually expanding or shifting the settlement's layout. This cycle of construction and destruction produced layered archaeological deposits that preserve outlines of buildings even after millennia. Despite their scale, Tripilia megasettlements did not persist indefinitely. After several centuries, many were abandoned. Environmental pressure, soil depletion, or social complexity may have made sustaining such large populations difficult over time. What remains today is pattern rather than structure. The true scale of these settlements is visible only through aerial survey and geophysical methods. The organization of space suggests deliberate social design. Circular layouts promote shared orientation rather than linear hierarchy. Movement through the settlement would have followed predictable paths, reinforcing collective rhythm rather than individual dominance. These megasettlements challenge traditional models of early urbanism. They show that large populations could exist without cities as later civilizations defined them. There are no palaces, no temples towering above houses, and no defensive walls marking exclusion. Instead, architecture emphasizes repetition, inclusion, and spatial balance. The Cucuteni Tripilia settlements represent an alternative pathway to complexity, one based on scale without stratified power. They demonstrate that early societies experimented with living together in large numbers long before states or empires emerged. The remains record a sustained attempt to organize communal life across vast spaces using shared rules rather than centralized control. These settlements remind us that early human history included large-scale social experiments that don't fit neatly into later categories. Their disappearance does not imply failure, but transition. New social forms replaced old ones as conditions changed. The fields that once supported thousands now appear quiet, with only subtle traces beneath the soil. Yet the circular patterns remain, preserving the outline of one of the most ambitious settlement experiments of the prehistoric world.